Good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, so EMinar Day. We've had to rearrange the schedule a little bit because of a withdrawal and some scheduling issues. So today you're going to hear a talk I gave on, I'll explain this shortly, by myself on publishing, which is a bit different from what you normally hear. Next week, we get back to EM type issues, and Vladimir Puzyarev will tell us about EM inversion using neural networks. And the week after that, we have Kerry Key giving us a talk on his Mari 2DEM code. Wonderful of Kerry to make this code available. And then Randy Mackey on geologically consistent inversion of geophysical data. Absolutely excellent. We all know Randy, and I think that'll be an excellent talk. And then Nadine Villette will give us a somewhat different talk. She'll tell us about her career as a geophysicist, a culmination of unplanned opportunities. And then Nasser Mekbel, who should have been today, but we've had to move, will tell us about MODIA. And then Malcolm Sambridge on optimal transport and geophysical inversion. Okay, the week after that, we have, and just to tell you about our, what we have on our MTNet page for EMinars. You can go on the EMinar page and you'll see prior videos and presentations, and you'll see registration for upcoming EMinars. And we've got a whole sequence right up until mid-July. And then we start again in October. And we're actively soliciting volunteers to propose their talks for the next season. So you're on a Zoom webinar, and the controls you have audio controls, chat control, raise your hand, and Q&A. So I think you all know that by now. So let me just stop sharing that, and I'll share the talk for today. When I can find it. There we are. It's not appearing. Just try that again. There it is. Okay. Right, so today we're going to talk about publishing and strategies. And this talk, actually, I gave, first of all, some years ago, my wife, who's an English as a second language teacher, and also a teacher of people to become teachers of English as a second language, was invited by China University Geoscience Beijing to give a one-week lecture course on scientific publishing in English. And my wife asked me to present a lecture on how to publish. And so I put this talk together, and I've given it a few times since, and I've been updating it as we go. So what I want to tell you now is my own views, and these views are change with time because the nature of publishing is changing with time. So it's publish or perish, as you can see. And sometimes it's publish and perish. Even your career might still perish even if you publish. So why do you publish? Well, because the main reason is to tell the world, and this world could either be your discipline, whichever that is. It could be your local world, so people in your country. It could be the broader geophysics world, or it could be even the whole geoscience world, or even the general public. So you want to tell the world about the results of your research. And, if you don't tell anyone what you did and what you found, then there's no point in having done that research. It remains silent. You're funded by public money, most of you, at least in academia. So you have a responsibility and a moral and ethical obligations to publish. It advances your career. Without publications, people who might want to hire you have got no basis on which to judge your ability to do research. In my view, it differentiates those with very strong technical skills from those who are research scientists, in as much as you can do all the technical work, but bringing it together in a holistic publication really calls on almost like detective-like skills. You must publish, so you do need to learn to care about it and to enjoy it. And don't think of it as a chore or a necessary evil. You must think of it as part of what you do as a research scientist. And I would say that in my own life, I've taken about 10% of my research time has been involved in the publication process. And so you have to think about that. Don't leave it as a last minute afterthought. You know, you've done all the fabulous research. Don't say, oh, damn, I've got to do the publishing now. You know, think about this. Okay, it's part of the research work that we have to do. And the point of publishing is not to publish for the sake of it, although sometimes this is necessary, you know, to get funded. But it's to publish so that there's a record of your research, and primarily so that your research results in impact and influence. And the whole point of publishing your work is that you want to modify the research behavior of others as a consequence of your own work. If your publication results in no impact or no influence, and one metric of this is citations, then your work was a waste of time. And unfortunately, you know, something like 50% of publications are never ever referenced. And the one thing that we often forget is the one thing that's in limited supply is our time. Our time is our most precious resource, and yet we tend to spend it wastefully. So don't waste your time publishing something that will have little impact. Work up your results and your data to make sure they do have impact. Okay. And learn to play the publishing game, and have a look at this chart. This is a really interesting chart I picked up a few years ago that shows the major reasons for rejection as a pie chart. And just look at that. Poor research only accounts for less than 1/3 of the rejected papers. So the other more than 2/3 are rejected for other reasons. And look at those other reasons. The main reasons are to do with the content of your paper and the structure of your manuscript. And both of those are in your hands. You have control of those. So you control the content, you control the structure of the manuscript. The English, we can talk about that. Manuscripts should not be submitted to English language journals in poor English, and then poor journal selection. The game can be quite tough, necessarily so, I think. And it can be very illogical. You can get all sorts of problems with reviewer workload, authorship, open access, statistical guidelines, all these sort of things. We're human and we're prone to error. Don't expect this game to be entirely logical. And it's very biased. This is an interesting figure I found yesterday that shows the probability of success in publishing in Nature as a function of your prior history of publishing in Nature. And the established, which is this purple line, have got a much stronger probability of success than somebody who's coming to Nature for the first time, which is the red line. And over time, this has got worse and worse. Your probability of success of publishing in Nature as somebody new to Nature is down at the 20% level. If you've been chaperoned, that means you've been a co-author on somebody else's paper in Nature, then you know you've got a chance. But just look how influential it is if you've published in Nature in a prior publication, you've got more success of publishing new papers in Nature. And don't think that your best work will have the impact it has. Publishing is not fallible, you know, not infallible. Some of the best work I think I've done, I've not got the number of citations I would expect them to have. And just remember this wonderful quote from Sir William Osler, a Canadian actually, ended up in, he was a medical scientist. He found one of the founders of Johns Hopkins, ended up at Oxford. And he said, in science, the credit goes to the man, and sorry about all the women. He said the man, this was the 1870s, the man who convinces the world, not to the man to whom the idea first occurs. So you might have a brilliant idea, but unless you set that idea in a global context, then somebody else will, and they will get the credit, not you. Just remember that no tectonic process is unique to your backyard. So when you're writing a paper about your results in your backyard, look for global correlatives and try to show what the similarities and differences are from the results you've found to those globally. Interesting comment by the editor of Journal of Chromatography, Paul Haddad, that these problems occur much too frequently. Submission of papers which are clearly out of scope of the journal, failure to format the paper according to the guide for authors, inappropriate or no suggested reviewers, inadequate response to reviewers, inadequate standard of English, resubmission of rejected manuscripts without revision. I do have to tell you, in my time as a scientist, I have seen papers come to me that were very poor. I rejected them. And then a month or so, 2 months later, I saw exactly the same manuscript come to me from a different journal. And so if your manuscript is rejected by a journal, don't submit it to another journal. We're a small community. We all know each other. The comments you get back on your manuscript, when it's rejected, you have to take them into consideration. Just a quick mention on preprint servers, because these are growing in importance, I think. And some science disciplines, particularly astrophysics and particle physicists and medical sciences, have been using these preprint servers for a number of years now, and they've got the hot results out on their preprint servers, Archive and medRxiv. And there's a new one that's been established for the Earth Sciences, Earth Archive. And the question is whether to go to a preprint server first before submission. And this is a maybe, I think. Personally, I'm not sure. There's lots of advantages, but there are some disadvantages to these preprint servers. And the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that you have to be careful of papers that are published on these servers. They are, for the most part, unvetted. They're not peer-reviewed. And there's problems. Misinformation can come out. Wrong information could come out. So the papers on the preprint servers may be questionable. And they may not have the intended impact. They might have too much impact for poor science, and they might have too little impact for good science. And also you might make an embarrassing error. And the peer review is positive for many reasons. And one positive thing is it could point out to you something, hey, look, you made a little bit of a mistake here. Having said that, though, and this is talk for another time, that the traditional publishing model is broken. There's far too many papers being submitted. We're all drowning in papers these days. It's far. So the publishing model does need to change. And so there may be a role for these preprint servers. So just before I tell you about this, let me very briefly tell you about me in terms of my scientific publishing record. So you know that I've got a little bit of knowledge about this. And so I've been a I was an editor of JGR for 12 years, on 3 different terms, and an editor of Geology for 2 terms. Former international editor of Earth, Planets and Space for 12 years. Methods editor for Surveys of Geophysics. I was the editor of the LAB, the Lithosphere Scientific Boundary Theme for GQ for 4 years. And I've been the special issues editor of many special issues. So on the editing side, you can see, there's 3 sides, right? There's the authorship side, the editorship side, and then the reviewer side. And I review typically 2 to 3 papers a month. And I've been doing this for 35 years. So, something like 1,000 papers. So I've done a lot of reviewing, and I've done a lot of editing, and I've done also a lot of publishing. So I've seen all 3 sides of the publishing game. So I've got 200 publications. My 200th publication was accepted a couple of weeks ago. I've been doing this for 43 years, so approximately 5 years. Some years more productive than others. You can see 2014, I managed to publish 19 papers. And some years less productive, 2008. But this doesn't mean that I did less work in 2008. It just so happens that work culminates serendipitously all at the same time. And in terms of my own publishing record, the journals I've chose to publish in, Geophysical Journal has had most of my papers, followed closely by JGR Solid Earth, and Canadian Journal Earth Sciences. And as you can see, Physics of the Planetary Interiors, Geophysics, Lithos, GRL, and so on. And in terms of citations to those papers, I'm doing quite well. I've got quite a decent citation number, almost 15,000, H index of 63. And so, my choice of what to publish and where to publish has resulted in some impact as measured by this metric. Now it's a faulty metric, we all know that, but it is one metric. And you can see my average citations per paper is 75, which is 8 times the average citation per paper in the geosciences. And I'm not saying this out of pride as much as just to say that I know how the game goes, if you want to have impact. If you look at my top 15 papers, what you see is something that's quite instructive. And that is the top 5 of the top 15 are to do with my work in Tibet. And that tells you something. It tells you you've got to go, if you want to have a lot of people reading your work, then you do work in areas that there's a lot of interest in. And a few years ago, I was working with my colleague Juan Carlos Afonso, and I said, how about applying your new method to this particular area? And he said, nobody cares about that area. And the point here is that you can do exactly the same work. The work I did in Tibet was no stronger or weaker than the work I did in other places. It's just there's a lot more people interested in Tibet. And so you end up with a lot more citations. But generally, the methodology papers and review papers are ones that are going to see you get a lot of citations. So if you look generally in my field, magnetotellurics, and using the search term on the Web of Science, and I did this search yesterday just to update it, there's almost 5,000 papers published with that search term and 75,000 plus citations to those papers and the 26,000 articles. So the citations per paper in MT is 16, which is good because the average is 9.5 in the geosciences. So as a field, the field of magnetotellurics is getting a citation rate slightly higher than average, 50% higher than average for the geosciences. And our publication rate is increasing. This is wonderful to see that the field is growing. The field of magnetotellurics is growing. And the citation rate is exponentially growing. You can see that the citation rate for papers in MT is at almost 8,000 citations in a year now. So the field of magnetotellurics, it took a while to become established as something that could address tectonic and geological questions, but it's been well established now. And as a consequence of that, we're seeing a much, much larger uptake within the broader community outside the local MT community, a broader community of people wishing to read our papers. When you look at the top authors, this gives you a sense of where the top authors are from, and you'll find actually a lot of authors from China, of course. Wei Wenbo, Jin Sheng, my colleagues, Gaofeng Yi, and then other authors going down the list. And the journals that the MT papers are mostly published in, the top journal is Geophysics, which is, as you know, an applied geophysics journal. And the second journal is Geophysical Journal. The third journal is the Chinese Journal of Geophysics, in Chinese, the Chinese edition. When we look at the top countries, the top country now, and the China overtook the US over the last few years, the top country in terms of publishing of MT papers is China. And this is as a direct consequence, I think, of the Sinoprobe project in China, that there are now more papers coming out of China on MT. But when you look at the language used of papers written in magnetotellurics, most, of course, are in English, 4,200. But of the 894 papers published by Chinese scientists, 288 are published in Chinese. Now, of course, those 288 papers are very accessible, of course, to Chinese people, but not accessible globally. And so that work won't have the global impact that it might deserve. And then you look at the citations per paper, and China publishes the most papers, but it's way down in terms of, it's 18th in terms of citations per paper. So why is that? That's strange, right? You know, it publishes the most papers, but in terms of its citations per paper, the average Chinese paper is cited 7 times compared to 14 for a US or British, 12 for 13 for a German paper. So what's the problem? And the problem is the accessibility of Chinese geoscience to non-Chinese scientists. And, you know, getting back to that prior number, that a third of the papers are published in Chinese. And so if you take those away, that number of 7 would immediately go up to 11 or 12. So the Chinese papers are published in Chinese. They might be published in non-mainstream Western journals, or they might be published in Western journals, but the paper might be less accessible, either because of the science or the language, or they're not set in a global context. And so these are the reasons why the Chinese papers are not having the impact that they perhaps should have. Let's have a look at all the papers in magnetotellurics now. What can we learn from that? And these are the top 10 papers in magnetotellurics that are cited today. The top paper is one from Tibet. And in fact, the first, the 6th, and the 9th paper is all about Tibet work. So Tibet again. But most of the papers that are well cited are methodology development papers. Occam's inversion, Randy Mackey's nonlinear conjugate gradients, Groom-Bailey decomposition, phase tensor, all the standard stuff we know, and then a review paper. So what you see here is a trend, right? You know, if you want to have impact, and again, we're measuring this with citations, it misses the impact that you might have. For example, papers published in geophysics have got lower citation numbers, but they have quite high impact because industry might take up the work. And so citations is not the only measure of impact. But if you do want to get a lot of impact, then have a new idea, have a methodology idea that people think is worthwhile taking up, or work in an area, a tectonic area, or a particular geographic area, or on a tectonic problem that people are very interested in, that are outside MT, or write a review paper. And that's more for more established scientists generally. So writing a paper, here we are now, finally get to talking about writing a paper. The first step is do the work, or the 0 step, before you even start writing, do the work. Make sure you got most of the work done before you start writing. You want to have 90% of the work done. And there'll be some iteration. As you write, you tend to start forming things coherently in your mind, and you might go back to repeating some of the work just to see how it comes. When you do the work, all of it has got to be, right from the very beginning of survey design, all of it has got to be the very best quality, because this is going to end up in the quality of your paper. So do everything: survey design, acquisition, processing, analysis, modeling, conversion, interpretation, to the highest quality you can, because that gives you then what you need in order to write the best paper you can. And any failings in any of these will seriously hamper your opportunities to publish. So when you're publishing, you're often selling a complete package, right from the very beginning. So then the first step is to make, when you're publishing, is make sure you have a story, right? So have you done anything of likely interest to anyone else? Will anyone care? Are you adding to the body of knowledge? And the second step, what is your story and who is your intended audience? Is this a new method? Is it a new or novel result or interpretation? Is it multidisciplinary? Is it report on an experiment, either a lab experiment or a field experiment? And the answer to these questions will direct you into the journal you should be aiming to publish in. Then the third step is choose your journal. And this is a very personal view I'm going to give you now. And I'm sure if any journal editors see this, they won't be happy and they'll give me a hard time. But there's no question the top ranked journals are Nature, in our field, is Nature, Geoscience, and Science. And the next ranked, in my view, are these, the AGU journals, JGR, Geophysical Journal International, GRL, EPSL, GCube, Tectonics, Precambrian Research, Lithos, Geology, Geophysics. And then there's what I call a third ranked, PEPI, Tectonophysics, Terra Nova, Solida. And then the fourth ranked, which I would think of as the more local journals, like Canadian Journal of Earth Science, the Journal of Asian Earth Sciences, the Journal of African Earth Sciences. And the quality of your manuscript has to match the quality of the journal. This isn't to say that you should put poor quality manuscripts into Journal of Asian Earth Sciences, not at all. But the bar is much higher if you want to go up to Nature or Nature Geoscience, much, much higher. And also pick the journal depending on your intended audience, and we'll discuss this in a minute. Just remember that you're competing for other people's time. You're competing, many other people are submitting papers. There's only a limited number of reviewers. There's only a limited number of editors. Everything is very precious. The system seems to be, I think the system is broken, actually. There's just far too much being submitted these days. I'm refusing to review 10 times as many papers as I can accept. And so you're competing for people's time, and they're gonna look at the abstract that you write, and we'll talk about the abstract in a minute. And you want them to spend their precious time on you, on your paper. And so you've got to make sure that your paper is worthwhile. And then just remember impact factors and eigenfactor scores, and these have a role. You have to not take them too far. And so you could think about where you want to publish in terms of this impact factor or eigenfactor. And the median impact factor in geoscience journals is 1.6, with a half-life of our papers of 8.5 years, which is interesting. It's longer than particle physics and that sort of thing. You know, the work we do has a longer half-life. If speed is important to you, then choose a speedy journal. And G Cubed, EPSL, GRL, Geology, they pride themselves on having a speedy process. Is open access important to you? Can you afford to publish in a for-profit journal? Or do you want to publish in a for-profit journal? If not, aim for a not-for-profit journal. Solid Earth, Earth and Planetary Sciences are open access. AGU has got this scheme where papers are open access that are after 2 years old and up to 20 years old. And so these give you opportunities to get your paper more accessible. Just to mention this eigenfactor, you might not be as familiar with it as you are with perhaps impact factors. But the eigenfactor is an attempt to measure the importance of a journal to the scientific community by considering the origin of incoming citations. And really, it's to try to measure how frequently the average researcher would access content from that journal compared to other journals. So here's the impact factor list. Not surprisingly, Nature and Science are at the top. And interestingly, when I put this together for the first time in 2016, the impact of Nature and Science impact factors were higher. Nature was 35 and Science was 29. And so these journals are actually beginning to have less impact than they did. And then the other journals, Nature Geoscience, which is one that people aim for as one of the top ranked journals, impact factor 13. GRL, JGRC 4.5, GRL 5. And you can get the impact factors by going to this particular web page. And then the eigenfactor score, just to repeat what it says, this eigenfactor score is slightly different. It says on average, people 1.5 times go and look in Nature, 1 1/3 times go and look in Science. But look what's happened here to JGR Solid Earth. Before, in terms of impact factor, is quite far down, only impact factor 4.5. But this says that it's a journal that people look at more than other geoscience journals generally. Geophysical Research Letters is a journal that people look at. Nature Geosciences eigenfactor score is quite low. People don't generally go to look at Nature Geoscience unless they're directed there by a paper they want to read. But don't be totally focused on this impact factor. In this new world that we have today, things are changing rapidly. Open access in not-for-profit journals is beginning to seen morally and ethically as more important than publishing in for-profit journals. And given wonderful search algorithms, you can find almost anything. What we're losing, though, with these search algorithms is serendipity. I mean, when I was a student, I used to go to the library every Wednesday morning. I blocked out Wednesday morning and I'd sit in the library for 3 hours and just pick up the journals and look at them from cover to cover, and then pick up different ideas, find interesting papers. And these days we're much more narrow in the way we search for research. So the top journals in magnetotellurics, just to repeat this, is Geophysics, Geophysical Journal International, Chinese journal, but this is the Chinese edition. So if you're writing an MT paper, just think, oh, well, those are the top published journals. So those may be the ones I should aim for. But the interesting thing is when you look at the impact factor against the number of MT publications, it's not at all a linear trend. So those journals that have high number of publications in them, Geophysics, doesn't have the same impact factors, right? So some journals have fewer MT papers in them, but have much higher impact factor. So again, the very personal view is where I go with my papers, right? And if I'm writing a paper that's a methodology paper, I aim it for Geophysical Journal International. If it's a more academic paper, I aim it for Geophysics, if it's an more applied paper, or computers and geosciences if it's a code paper. If it's a spectacular novel result or interpretation, I try to aim for one of the top journals, Nature Geoscience, Science. Very high quality research, I would aim for these other top journals. Multidisciplinary work, I would aim for these more multidisciplinary journals. G Cubed, I like a lot. Lithos, I like a lot. Geology, EPSL, tectonics, Precambrian research. If it's an experimental report of global interest, I might aim for this. If it's an experimental report more of local interest, I would aim for more local journals. And if it's a thematic paper on geothermics, on volcanology, or an applied paper, geophysics, geophysical prospecting, page off. So these are the choices you make when you're writing your paper. Try and find the journal that's appropriate for your work. If you want to go with a short format, and it's very hard, can be very hard to write in a short format paper, write your work up. Nature, Geoscience, Science. Medium size, you go to EPSL, and a full paper, of course, JGRSE or G Cubed. And short stories are often much harder to tell than long stories, and particularly in magnetotellurics. As a community, we're rather hard on ourselves in as much as reviews that come back tell us, well, you've got to do more 3D inversion. And we have trouble getting into short format journals because the reviewers demand so much justification. Don't go cheap. Don't go to what you think of as a lower quality journal because you think it's going to be an easier ride. Those journals will have less readers, the lower quality journals. And so you're going to have less chance of having impact. You've spent a lot of time and effort planning your fieldwork, acquiring data, processing, analyzing, modeling, inverting data. And this is a very personal view because I'm a field-based scientist, but if you're a numerical person, you spend a lot of time developing your numerical ideas and implementing those in code and trying to show the application of them. You spend a lot of time on that. So you owe it to yourself and to the community and to whoever's funded your work. You owe it to aim as high as possible. Personally, I try to avoid conference publications, mainly because they're slow. They go at the rate of the slowest author. And so if you have a journal, a conference publication with 20 authors in, it won't come out until the 20th author has finally written and revised. And they tend not to have that much impact. When I compare conference publication rates to normal journal publications, they tend to have a lower impact. They tend to be lower quality because the invited editors, who are not the standard editors, they like to see a decent number of papers in these conference publications. And so they do tend to accept lower quality papers. And those papers might not be accepted in a normal journal. Thematic issues I really do like. And for example, the LAB theme in G Cubed, all the papers in that have got high impact because people look at one or two papers and then they see the others. And so you can get much greater exposure if you're in a thematic issue. And these thematic issues, they have defined deadlines for submission and revision. Avoid predatory journals. There's zero impact. And in fact, this work done recently just to show the citation rate of papers in predatory journals. And this is done by Nature, surprisingly. Why would they do that? Nature looked at 250 papers in predatory journals, and you can get a list of them from this website. 60% got no citations. 13% only got one. Very few, less than 2%, got a decent number of citations. So very limited readership of these papers in predatory journals. Now you've chosen your journal and you've taken your time to do this. You know, it's important to take your time. You go to the website and download the instructions for authors. And it's super important to follow these instructions precisely. Every single, you know, the font and the margin size and the line spacing and all that sort of thing. Because if you submit something that's not following those, the editor, if the editor's doing the job, will send the paper back to you. And what you've done already is you've given the editor a sort of a negative view of your paper just because you've not followed those instructions, right? So make sure you don't do anything to give the editor an opportunity to reject your paper on anything but the science. Now you've chosen your journal, and it's important to choose your journal before you write, because different journals have different emphases on how they want to have things presented. So now you're going to write your text for that journal and write it in bullet form. Once you've got an outline in bullet form, then construct your figures and your tables. This is a personal view again, but figures are far more important than the body of the text for attracting readers. Don't start at the beginning and write linearly to the end. Leave the introduction or conclusions, and especially the abstract, to the last. They're the most important of all, and they're the first to be read by anyone, particularly the abstract, and so demand the most focus and the most time. And what you're going to say in your introduction and your conclusion or abstract will come from the body of the paper. So you have to write the body of the paper first. And think of an attractive title. And one of my favorite titles of one of my papers is Parkinson Pointer's Potential Perfidy. And it's very hard to get the grammar right. Now you write. You're writing the body of the paper. It is very, very important that you do not plagiarize. And particularly those of you for whom English is not the first language. This is tough, I understand that. You read something and it sounds so well, and that's exactly the concept that you want to portray in your paper as well. And you find it hard to find another way to say the same thing, so you write it down the same way. A lot of journals are using some apps, Authenticate and Turnitin, to check for plagiarism. And so you have to be very careful. If you're caught plagiarizing, that is a black mark, and your name will go around the community as a plagiarist. Introduction, conclusions, finally abstract. And be very, very careful with figure captions. I often find when I'm reviewing papers that the figure captions are really poor. And this is don't understand that. Many people, when they're looking at a paper, they'll read the abstract and they'll look at the figures and they'll read the figure captions. And so to me, they're super important to have really good figure captions. And then check the spelling, the grammar, the sentence structure, the citations, the references, and do not write in poor English. I am now at the point where I return to the journal any papers I'm asked to review, which will take my time to correct the English. I used to do this in the past. I used to spend as much time on the English as I did in the science. And I thought, well, this is silly. You know, the author has to write in really good English, right? It has to portray the story in good English. And it's not my job to correct the English. It's to judge the science. So once you've checked the spelling, the grammar, and the sentence structure, and the citations and the references, check it all again. And once you've checked it all again, check it a third time. And then check it until you're sick of checking it. And then check it once more. Don't give the reviewers any cause to become frustrated or annoyed at language usage or any non-science issue. Reviewers should focus on the science and only on the science, and not be distracted by poor language usage or poor formatting or poor structure or any other non-science issues. So here's how you build it up like a pyramid. The figures, the methods, results, the discussion, the conclusions, the introduction, and the title and the abstract. And in fact, in publishing, there's what's called a EMinar format. The introduction is when you lay out the structure of the paper, the EMinar format. In the introduction is what question was studied. The methods is how was that problem studied? The results are what are the findings, and the discussion is what do these findings mean? So tell the readers what you did and the important findings. So in this abstract, depends on the journal. Some journals are very short, 50 words. Some are longer, 300 words. And they often require bullet points, highlight bullet points. So you've got to really focus on this. It's super important to get the abstract right. And it's an advertisement for your article. There's going to be loads of these. People just often read lots of abstracts. They don't go into the paper unless the abstract attracts them. And a clearly written abstract will strongly influence if your work will be considered further for review or for publishing or for reading. And here's an example talking about what was done and what are the findings. In the introduction, this is the place where you convince your readers that your work is relevant. And you start with the general and you become more specific with successive paragraphs. So it answers the question, what is the problem? Are there any existing solutions? Which one is the best or the most current solution? What's its limitations? What are you hoping to achieve with your paper? What do you want to convince the readers about? And that's what the introduction is. It reviews the field and says, look, this is where the field is now, and I've made this advance. I want you to read about this advance I've made. Now, something that I found out about from my wife is those of you not from English-speaking countries might have a different rhetorical style. And there's particularly a very strong difference between Eastern and Western rhetorical styles of writing and even thinking. These are reflected in scientific writing. So if you want to publish in Western literature, you have to adopt the English writing style. And even this writing style is very different from the writing style in the Romance languages, French, Italian, and Spanish. And so these are the main differences. I won't go over these in detail. You can look them up for yourselves. There's a wonderful free to download paper by Agi Pinzon, comparing Eastern and Western rhetorical thought. In the Western style, our papers are very instructional, and it's the duty and responsibility of the writer to impart meaning. So the writer takes on the primary responsibility of creating the meaning. They have to spell out everything for the reader, the main ideas and the details and how the details to connect to one another as the main idea. But in the Eastern rhetorical style, this is much more didactic. And it's the reader's responsibility to deduce some meaning. The task of the writer is to stimulate the reader into contemplating the issues that might not have been previously considered. And so it's a pattern of idea development in which there's a delayed introduction of purpose. The main ideas are not strongly stated from the outset. They develop through the paper. This gets the readers to think for themselves, to consider the observations and to draw their own conclusions. So these two very different styles. So those of you who might be Eastern thinking, you have to unfortunately adopt the Western rhetorical style. So now you've written the paper and you've checked it and checked it and checked it and checked it. Now, before submitting it, have an internal review. And that internal review could be a colleague, it could be a co-author. Some co-authors get a free ride in as much as they put on the paper because they got you the funding or they allowed you to work in their country or whatever, right? Well, now you can ask them to do some work to justify the position as co-author. Or, but better than that though, is a colleague. And you want this person to play what's called a devil's advocate. You want this person to be as hard as possible, to be as harsh as possible. Particularly if you're not English language speaking, then try and find an English language speaking Westerner who will agree to be the devil's advocate. And this person has got to be really nasty in the way they attack your paper. You shouldn't, and it's better, you know, it's better that these tough words come from your colleague prior to review rather than these tough words come back from the reviewers. Because, you know, a harsh review from a reviewer will kill your paper. It'll kill it dead for that journal and make it much more difficult for other journals. You can exchange the papers. Personally, I really like the track changes and comment feature in Word. It's a bit harder to do in LaTeX, but there's now web tools to do that. And I'm writing a paper with some colleagues using LaTeX, following it on web tools where we can comment and annotate and make changes that track. If my students and co-authors write in LaTeX, I often ask them to send me a Word version. And you've got to, there's a LaTeX to Word app that you can go to, and I mark the Word version up and I send it back, and then they put the changes into the LaTeX version. So you revise after internal review. You go through all these comments of your internal reviewer very carefully. You address them all. You don't say, well, that doesn't matter. You know, he doesn't quite understand. he's perhaps a potential audience member, right? And then you prepare your final text and you prepare your final versions of your figures, and please spend a lot of time on your figures. Does the figure emphasize what you want it to? Perhaps a change of color scale might bring out the points you want to emphasize better. Something that geologists are very good at, but we geophysicists not as good at, is make sure that any locality you mention in the text appears on a map. Make sure the text in your figures is legible. Make sure everything in the figure is necessary and needed. Don't put unnecessary stuff in. And then you compile your final PDF for submission. Choosing potential reviewers. So think about who could be good reviewers for your work and who might not be good reviewers. So always try to suggest strong names from strong institutions as potential reviewers. So one caution, it was quite interesting. When I first gave this, it was for my colleagues in China. And so I found this amazing article that in fact, Chinese reviewers are harder on Chinese authors than non-Chinese reviewers. So just know that your peers may not be your friends. So you could suggest those who appear in your reference list, whose work you're referring to. And particularly if you speak highly of them, they'll be favorably disposed to accept your paper for review. If you're writing a multidisciplinary paper, give names of people from different areas of expertise. You don't want any conflict of interest. You can't have anybody from your same institution and no one you've collaborated with for the last, say, 5 years. And avoid poor reviewers. These poor reviewers may be ones who are slow, who don't do a good job, and people who naturally are very negative about anybody else's work. And you know who these are. And I won't give you examples, but we all know. And also your friends may not be your friends when they're reviewing your manuscript, right? And then you have to pick the editor. Journals often have a number of editors and you could direct it towards one. And again, pick carefully. Then you're going to write a letter to your editor explaining why this paper is worthy of publication. Explain the importance of what you've done. That it's totally new and it's unpublished anywhere, or that a certain percentage was previously published in a different journal. You have to say that all the co-authors approve submission of this, and hopefully they do. And you have to say why you've chosen that editor's journal. Why particularly of all the choices? Why you're giving them these names of reviewers? Why you think these are good reviewers to choose for the paper? And why you're listing some names of people that you'd rather the paper not go to because of conflict of interest or conflict generally. Then you submit via the journal's web portal. Wonderful. I mean, when I first started publishing a course, you had to post the type thing in. Never, ever, 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 ever submit a poor paper. Never. Both in terms of the science or the English language or other issues, poor figures, poor referencing. Don't expect the reviewers to do your job. Don't write a half-finished story and expect them to give you some clues as to how to interpret your data, or how to give, or giving appropriate global correlative examples to your own. If you submit a poor paper, not only will you have your paper rejected, but what you'll find is that editors and reviewers have memory. They'll remember you. You'll find it harder to get your papers accepted for review and published with them. Just remember that a paper represents you. It makes a statement about you, about who you are as a scientist and a person. You surely want that to be the highest quality and of the highest integrity, because that is you. Now you wait. It goes out for review, or you wait for a decision by the editor not to send it out for review. And this, unfortunately, is very true of the top journals, Nature Science and Nature Geoscience. And while you're waiting, you could start to write your next paper. What happens if you get a rejection by the editor? The editor doesn't even send it out for review. And what you've got to appreciate is that these top journals, far more than half the papers are not sent out for review. In Nature from 2006, 60% rejection by the editor. Nature Geoscience, 82%. 4/5 of the papers submitted are sent out, are rejected by the editor, don't go for review. Is there anything you can do about this? Can you challenge an editor's decision? Yes, you can. The answer is yes. You can write back and say, look, I think you made a bit of a mistake here. But it can be long, it can be very frustrating, and it's dubious whether it's worthwhile. So let me just tell you the story of a couple of papers. Here's a paper I wrote with my student, Florian Lepape. We submitted it to Nature Geoscience in May 2011 on the Kunlun Fault, in Tibet. And we talked about melt propagation in finger-like style beyond the Kunlun Fault. We thought it was revolutionary. It was rejected without going out for review by Amy Whitchurch, who's the associate editor of Nature Geoscience. And her comment was, you can read it here in the present case, we have no doubt that your findings, so let me just highlight that comment. We have no doubt that your findings regarding penetrative intrusion of melt northwards from the Tibetan crust will be of inherent interest to fellow specialists. But, there's always a but, right? But we are unable to conclude that the paper would be likely to excite the immediate interest of researchers in the broad range of the geosciences. Wow, quite damning, right? So I wrote back to Amy Whitchurch and said, look, we've published already 4 papers on Tibet work in top journals, 3 in Science and 1 in Nature. And this was in 2011. And these are the citations of those papers. And the citations are much higher now. So these citations demonstrate that the work we're doing using magnetotelescopes in Tibet is having a lot of impact, is having influence, is being read outside the field. So we ask you to reconsider your decision to reject. She took 2 months to decide what to do about this and replied, in response to your letter, we've decided to send the paper out for review. So tough reviews came back. That required a lot more. It took another year of work to accept these reviews. And if you look at that paper, our supplementary material is huge. It's another paper. Finally accepted in March 2012. As of yesterday, we have 90 citations. which is 9 times the impact factor of Nature Geoscience. So there she was rejecting a paper, which at the moment has got 9 times the average impact factor. Well, let me tell you about another paper submitted about the same time. And this, my colleague Azar Gotze, we submitted a paper to Nature Geoscience describing empty measurements made immediately after the devastating Longmenshan earthquake of 2008. And Whitchurch wrote back saying, unfortunately, we do not believe that the manuscript provides a sort of conceptual advance in unscientific understanding that would be likely to excite the immediate interest of researchers in a broad range of other areas. Almost exactly the same words that she wrote in our Le Pape paper. So I composed a similar email as the one that we sent in the Le Pape paper, and I sent that to my colleague Azar Gotze, and he sent it into Whitchurch asking for reconsideration. So over 2 months later, 72 days later, sat on her desk. And then she said, our review remains that your manuscript does not significantly advance our understanding of the processes responsible for the Wenchuan earthquake on the evolution of the Longmenshan topography more general and beyond that, shown in existing studies. And what had happened is that Azar Gotze had published a little bit of the work already in Geologica Acta, a Hungarian journal, just a few papers, just saying, look, we did this work and we found this. And what Whitchurch had done is obviously done a search, and she'd found that some of the stuff had already been published. And so decided not to justify its publication. And so the important lesson here, don't publish your results in short form and expect to get them out later in a longer form. Don't waste your time publishing in a lower quality journal, Geological Acta. It can harm you. So we submitted it to Geology and eventually accepted. It took 8 months, so we had some work to do. That paper's got 151 citations as of yesterday, 15 times the impact factor of Nature Geoscience. And so, you know, Amy Whitchurch, in my mind, has screwed up twice for us. And, you know, probably many of you got the same story. And so it's not as logical as you want. It can be quite arbitrary, right? And so the story here is that Nature Geoscience and Science and Nature, they're looking for any reason at all to reject your paper without review, because they are suffering from the thousands of papers that come in every day. So you're going to get your reviews back. Hopefully it's not rejected, but is accepted subject to revision, minor, moderate, or major. And so these days, I mean, in 20 years ago, you got back accepted with minor revision or accepted with moderate revision or accepted with major revision. But these days, journals tend not to accept with major revision because they want to have good statistics about their publication rate. So if a paper needs major revision, the code you get back is it's rejected, but with a comment that the journal would look favorably upon a heavily revised version, taking the comments of the reviewers into account. And I've had that happen to me a couple of times. The extent of the review of the revisions requested was thought to take too long, and that would impact badly, negatively on the statistics of the journal. These journals, they want to have, good statistics about how fast they publish. And in some way, they're faking it by having these major things rejected, but then asking you to resubmit once you've met the review revisions. Here's an acceptance probability statistic I found. If you have 2 reviewers and their reviewers are these on the left, and here's your probability of acceptance. And just look, if you have one of your reviewers giving a reject, your probability is well below 50%. So you've got to really avoid getting a reject from any reviewer. You can do much better with these accept with major, accept with minor. But if you get a single reject, the editor will look at that and say, yeah, we'll reject it. So now you're revising and you go through each and every comment made by the reviewers and the editors, each and every one, and you provide a response. So what I do, I always take these things and I put them into a Word document, and I write underneath in red exactly how I've addressed each and every comment. And my addressing might be to say, yeah, I agree totally. This has been corrected. This new text was added. My addressing might be to say, yes, I didn't explain it well and I've revised it. Or my addressing the way I've addressed it might be to say, yeah, perhaps the reviewer is not quite right here because of this reason, right? You don't have to agree with every comment or suggestion made by the reviewers. But just remember, the way the system works, it's heavily weighted to the reviews, the views of the reviewers. It has to be. It considers the reviewers to be impartial, so it considers their views to be of stronger weight than your views as an author. So if you're going to oppose a reviewer, you need very strong, unassailable arguments. But remember, the reviewer is your friend. Think of the reviewer as your friend. The reviewer represents your intended audience, right? Don't ever become annoyed or antagonistic towards reviewers. And as an editor, I've seen some really awful things written by authors about reviews. And they think, well, this author doesn't get it. The reviewers shouldn't be blamed. They're the reviewers are intended audience. And if the reviewer misunderstood your work, you didn't say it right. It's not the reviewer's fault. So what do you do with competing reviews? Some say, this is great. Others say, this is poor. Some says, do this. Others say, do that. Well, you take the views of the reviewer that you think is right for objective reasons. And don't take the reviews of the reviewer because you think this person is more senior or because of collegiality or because of nationality. Be very objective about this and say, this reviewer, I think, has got it right. I'm going to follow this person. I'm going to follow that review because I think that's right. And explain very carefully in the response to your editor that there are competing reviews and you've chosen the view of reviewer A over reviewer B because. Submit the revised version. List all the comments made by reviewers and all your responses. Submit a PDF of your revised manuscript, and a PDF lists the differences. This is very easy to do in Word, of course. You can do a difference, and so the editor can very quickly see that you've gone through all these and you've done what you said. And then write a letter to the editor stating you've heavily revised the manuscript and addressed all the comments. And now you go back to step 11, which is wait. And so not quite a black hole, and here's submit a paper, the editor does a job and then assigns reviewers, sends it out for review, editor collects reviews, makes a decision, rejects or accepts, or may go for revision. So there is this process, and you can find this by Michael Duntle, who wrote a nice article on the basics of research paper writing and publishing at this link here. Your manuscript's been accepted. Woohoo! Yay! Great! At last. Yeah, just remember that this is the paper I referred to earlier, and you can find it at this link. Do Chinese authors get a fair shot? Is it a crapshoot? There's some nice e-learning modules on how to write a journal paper by Springer, this particular link you can go to. And there's some other reading by How to Write a Great Paper on this link from Anthony Newman of Elsevier. And just remember this statement, and I can't find who said this. Everybody, a lot of people quoting this, but I don't know who the author was of the statement. But poor experimentation cannot be masked by brilliant writing. However, poor writing can mask brilliant experimentation. So in Chinese, good luck with your writing. But as Thomas Jefferson does, I'm a great believer in luck. And I find the harder I work at it, the more I have of it. Well, thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, you can send them into the Q&A. If you want to discuss anything, just let me know. Gone slightly over time. Okay, no questions coming in. Well, thanks everybody. Brilliant. See you all next week at the same time. Okay, bye for now.